Archaeodeath, walking in the footsteps of past funerals.
Archaeodathlings, it's Archaeology Professor Howard Williams here, and for a recent University Admissions Day, I thought I would give a taster lecture that's different. And having in a previous Admissions Day done a talk about the archaeology of the Star Wars universe, focusing on the Disney Plus series Ahsoka, which explores the post-imperial clashes and conflict between the remnants of the Jedi, false Jedi, and the re-emergence of Grand Admiral Thrawn, I thought I would share with you some of my reflections in another talk, this one focusing on the Mandalorian and the book of Boba Fett. So what I'm doing is presenting to you via YouTube a talk I've given to prospective students, not to be illustrating anything typical about the experience of being lectured at university, but giving an example of some of the range of ways we can approach thinking archaeologically, applying archaeological ideas, theories, and methods to different kinds of data sets. And in this case, a fictional galaxy a long time ago, far, far away. So let's get into it. So I called the paper ORAS, the Outer Rim Archaeological Survey, Archaeology a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And those are some of my blog posts addressing this topic. So I started off by asking what is archaeology and reminding people that a formal definition of what archaeology is, and this is I think originally from Christian Christiansen, but it could be from one or many archaeologists, is it's about the study and preservation of the material remains of past societies and their environments. So it's about exploring the past and preserving and interpreting the traces of that past in the present. And our aim is to do this to understand and explain those past societies and their significance in today's world, to preserve the past, but also to educate people about that story. Most of the human story is only accessible through material traces. And for the periods where we have textual evidence and visual sources of other kinds, they are basically subsets of archaeological data. They are specialist forms of archaeology. And even for those societies, most people's stories are only surviving to us through the traces of what they did and how they are, those traces are mediated through material culture, monuments, art, and other non-textual media. And of course, in doing so, we hope to foster study and understanding, appreciation of our human story that informs who we are and informs where we're going. And to do this, I contended in the talk, we need to understand archaeology's place in contemporary society and popular culture. And that archaeology is such an embedded part of how we think about different worlds, other times, other places, and that extends not from simply attempts to narrate stories about past times, but also how we deal with fictional worlds, including genres of horror, historical fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. And so we can apply an archaeological approach to not only the material evidence of human pasts on a real world, but also to the rich and complex material cultures, built environments, and landscapes that have been created in immersive television, video game, and filmic settings for other non-existent, never happened times, fictional environments, and in this case, the Star Wars universe. Now, there's been a number of archaeologists who have already commented in blog posts and in articles on the archaeology of Star Wars and its different elements. And some archaeologists go down the route of thinking about the traces of Star Wars in our world, the many different material cultures, from toys to art to film sets, that survive in our world and are part of our Star Wars universe that fosters heritage tourism, helps mediate connections and to stories of past times. There's a lot of overlap for people between their investment and interest and engagement with historic places and the way those historic places were used in film context, from the Mayan pyramids to early Christian monasteries on the west coast of Ireland, settings and landscapes that inspired and appeared in the various films and television shows, and which then inspire engagement and interpretation of those landscapes. We also have the fact that archaeologists and antiquarians are found in Star Wars, in the Star Wars universe, in different guises, both formalized investigations, but as we saw in the discussion of Ahsoka Tano, a number of different ways in which the characters act like archivists, researchers, adventurers, detectives, and revelators, revealers of hidden knowledge, spiritual or otherwise. So a lot of the adventure that we're taken on involves archaeologists and antiquarians, or characters that informally and perhaps not even explicitly take on the tropes that we associate in popular culture with archaeologists and antiquarians. In addition to that, the Star Wars universe is full of cultures, places, and material cultures that are inspired by our world's prehistoric, ancient, medieval, and modern eras to create this immersive world building that is meaningful to us, that the human past is drawn upon and reconsidered. And I've talked about that in blog posts, for example, discussing the series, the set during the years of the Empire of Andor, and I've talked about the Lutheran as an antiquarian and various other archaeological themes in that series. I've also talked about that in terms of Ahsoka and the representation of ancient ruins, as well as living cultures that are encountered and are inspired by the archaeological past. And archaeological and heritage themes and issues, including colonialism and indigeneity, and the tensions between them, the sense of a fragmented deep time story that is only partially understood, and that we see change and collapse within these universes, are often therefore mediating archaeological and heritage themes. What is valued, what is preserved, how people encounter those traces and interpret them. And the landscapes of these worlds are deep time, therefore drawing on those both those themes. We see material cultures, architectures, and landscapes that have power in the stories. They're part of the setting and the action. They give meaning to the various different narratives that we perceive. And for all these reasons, therefore, we can pursue an archaeology of Star Wars by looking at the media and material cultures produced, but also by looking at the created virtual material world, the immersive environments. And so I invited students to join me on the ORAS, the Outer Rim Archaeological Survey, in this case exploring the world of the Mandalorian, the three series out at the time of speaking from 2019, 20 and 2023, and the kind of interleaved with that, the book of Boba Fett that sits between seasons 2 and 3 of the Mandalorian and involves the Mandalorian, at least in the later episodes, engaging with the Tatooine world of gangsters and crime lords. And so I invited those that attended the talk to dig into Star Wars material cultures, built environments, monuments, and landscapes, and to ask what can they tell us about archaeological inspirations and themes for Outer Rim societies and cultures, and what this can tell us about our relationship with archaeology and archaeologists. Now, there's a lot that could be done here, even with The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. But I made the point that the series takes us to see a host of different planets with different environments and different cultures and peoples. Many of these planets have more than one species and different cultures, and some of them have traces of the deep time. So these are the key ones we see. And while some of them are in the core or the deep core, Coruscant, Tython, and the Glavis ring world, we also have a range of planets that are mostly in the outer rim, and that these constitute a poorly understood, sparsely populated edge of this fictional galaxy, set in the year 9 after the Battle of Yavin, where the Death Star is destroyed. So we see the set after the end of the empire in this post-imperial world, a frontier zone being explored. And I think that's really important for why this show is so appealing, because it is very much a space western, as many people say. We have Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, or is he? Because we learn that actually Grogu is the Mandalorian. We have Din Djarin, a Mandalorian, who encounters a um, a baby, but a 50-year-old Grogu, who had been trained as a Jedi at the Jedi Temple, had escaped with the massacre of the Temple by Anakin Skywalker, and has somehow found himself to Avala 7, where he is being kept by a gang of criminals, we're led to believe. We don't understand the full backstory, but Din Djarin, rather than assassinating him as requested, and bringing him back alive for the Imperial Remnant, either of those options were given to him. He kills IG-11, the assassin droid sent to also retrieve the package, the retrieve Grogu, and they form an alliance. And so it's very much a space western, an adventure of Din Djarin and Grogu exploring worlds, trying to find Grogu back to the Jedi, and then back to Mandalore, and to restore the Mandalorians to power. That's the arc of the storylines. So it's a space western, but I contend that as an archaeologist interested in the late antique and early medieval worlds, this is very much about a European and Mediterranean, but particularly Northwest European, a barbarian after empire theme and aesthetic. This is an idea of a world that's broken up, fragmentary, deep time, ancient, and we see these characters adventuring, detecting, and revelating within, as kind of antiquarians and archaeologists within this ancient world. And there are many different types of archaeology in this world we can explore. And here are but some examples. So we encounter in the deep core, in their adventures. I'm not taking this in chronological order. I'm trying to sort of give you some examples. We have traces of the ancient past, a stone circle, which is described as a force henge on Tython. And in other series in the Star Wars extended universe, we encounter the idea that the Jedi and also the witch sisters of Dathomir and others are using stone circles as not simply places of worship, but as places of intercession with the Force. So this is never made properly clear in the Mandalorian, but we have these leaning stones, these erected but leaning stones, as an adaptation of prehistoric architectures from Northwest Europe, seen as places, as following a very much a New Age tradition of interpretation of prehistoric monuments in our world, as a place of spiritual intercession. The tombs leaning, the stones leaning, also give an aesthetic linked to another tradition of the dolmen tomb tradition, and also the central domed sort of orb that's at the center of this monument also echoes another famous fantasy monument, the seeing the stone of Erich, which is recorded as a relic of Numenor brought to Gondor, and is used by Aragorn on a hilltop to call the dead to fulfill their vow and fight for Gondor against the hordes of Mordor. And so we have here a sort of, whether directly inspired, a similar idea of it's a prehistoric monument, but there's also some kind of extraterrestrial, overtly unusual element of this central stone sphere, which is carved in runes, linking it to the late Iron Age traditions of rune carved monuments. So you have a hilltop monument, which is unlike where we find prehistoric stone circles in real world landscapes. So it's deliberately not trying to mimic prehistoric monuments, but inspired by prehistoric monuments. And the very name of calling it a henge, of course, refers to a specialist archaeological category of monument that this fictional world doesn't understand, because henges are not stone circles, they're different. There are monuments that have both, such as Arborough in Derbyshire, Stanton Drew in Somerset, and of course, most famously, Stonehenge. And the henge name is what gives that archaeological category its meaning, but Stonehenge is actually an unusual henge because it doesn't have timber uprights, it has stone, and those stone uprights have trilithons, and therefore there's a popular misunderstanding of what a henge is that is then fed into this fictional world, which I think is very interesting in itself in terms of the modern reception and understanding of prehistoric monuments of earth and timber and of stone, that this is seen as a henge in the Star Wars universe, when it is of course not a henge. There's no defining feature of a henge, which is a um, bank and ditch, a circular bank and ditch with the bank on the outside. But you can see here that there's a central arrangement of 6 standing stones, some low dolmens and trilithons around the back edge, and some pillars, some outer standing stones at a lower level. So this is both like a real world monument and actually very unlike a real world monument. And it's more akin to a 19th century folly, um, inspired by those monuments, than it's actually directly inspired by prehistory. But it fits our aesthetic of an ancient monument where Grogu is taken to try and call to other Jedi, if there's any surviving, to enhance, to amplify his connection to the Force, to seek out any other surviving Jedi. And so this isolated, long abandoned location with this internal space with 2 steps and then the stone orb at the center is isolated and seemingly safe. But of course, this is the place where Grogu becomes abducted, having tried and used up all his energy communicating. So how mysteriously activating the central orb and making the runes glow. Very much an overlap with the fantasy world of Tolkien and others, where runes are imbued with magical power. So there's lots of fantasy ideas playing into this evocation of the ancient past. It links to ideas of Weathertop from Amon Sul from the Fellowship of the Ring. It links to the Stone of Erich, which appears in the Return of the King book, but not in the film series. There's lots of that sort of fantasy world. Ancient monuments are places of intercession with supernatural powers. But there are also other material traces populating this universe that speak of the storyline. So it's very important that the story encounters the ruins of empire, the immediate past of the mech, the that is reused by barbarians and warlords and crime lords and locals, the imperial sort of infrastructure that's reused. We encounter an AT-AT that's used by some local barbarians or a group of raiders on Sorgan who attack villages and plunder. We also encounter the relics of old imperial bases that we find are still being used. So there's a broader relics of the imperial past that sort of still haunt the landscapes and have the potential to be brought back, reactivated. So there's a sinister legacy of surviving material culture. And also there are trophies celebrating the imperial defeat. So after 9 years, in Mos Eisley, Mos Espa, you still have no, it's Mos Eisley. Sorry, you still have the sort of trophies of spiked stormtrooper helmets celebrating or evoking that sense of the breakdown of law and order, the destruction of the empire, and how individual planetary systems and societies negotiate that regime change. And we learn that that happens in a very violent way in Mos Pelgo, and the replacement of the mining guild and we hear about in the book of Boba Fett other guilds, including the Pikes and the Hutts, who are vying for power over these after the empire has collapsed. And so this material is really important. And on Carthon, where we encounter the chop fields, and on Coruscant in season 3, here in season 1 in Carthon, and season 3 we encounter material remnants which are still potentially dangerous. And in Ahsoka we have the same narrative, this idea that the Corellian shipbuilding is being manipulated and misused to make engines for Morgan Elsbeth to explore to Peridia to find a Grand Admiral Thrawn. And so we have this idea that the material of the New Republic are trying to destroy, to dismantle the mechanized galaxy, spacecraft, industrial installations, colonial settlements. There are scavengers and including and Jawas who are manipulating those remains and reusing them. But also there's attempts to completely destroy them on Carthon by ripping them up. But also on Coruscant, we find that the former troops are rehabilitated, but the scrap is mothballed, but becomes potentially open to reuse and misuse. And another form of almost sinister ongoing legacy of the Empire are droid worlds, both on Tatooine, but also particularly on Plesir 15 in season 3 of The Mandalorian. We encounter whole societies that are reliant on reprogrammed Imperial droids. And so we have not only just the sort of the reliance on droids as an integral part of the entire universe, but particular planets that are so reliant on droids that they are there's a potential for them to be misused, and of course they are. Some of them are turned to violence to attack the population, and so there's a story based on Plesir 15, where the Mandalorian is commissioned to find out what's going on with the droids and find out, yes, it's not the droids, but it's nanotechnology that is corrupting the droids, so that's deliberately planted there. So we have this idea of this vast legacy of material culture from an imperial era that is still has to be contended with. It's a dark legacy that haunts these landscapes and these peoples. And this takes a more sinister form with those societies that are encountered where imperial remnants are still in control, and architectures and sort of the archaeological past, more broadly, the human past, is evoked to create the sense of the medieval feudal systems. So on Caladan, in the walls of Caladan on the planet of Corvus, we encounter Morgan Elspeth, who's become a magistrate, and she is controlling the population and destroying the planet's forests through overexploitation as part of her enslaving of the population to with droids as henchmen and bounty hunters as her second in command, punishing miscreants at her gates, and this architecture of medieval power, very much evoking Far East Asian medieval walls, particularly castles in Japan and Korea, to give that sense of oppressive control in a in a science fiction world. That the walls here are not so much about keeping people out as keeping people in. They define her palace and her beautiful gardens as opposed to the relative poverty of the rest of the city, but the outer gates are about defending against invaders, but also protecting and controlling the population within, keeping them working for the magistrate. And on Morak, where the ISB are still extracting rare and dangerous fuel sources, rhydonium, we see the colonial population, and Mayfield reflects on whether these populations understand the difference between the Empire and the New Republic, and their resentment, and we get a sense of a galaxy that is exposed to colonial exploitation. So we see many sort of native and indigenous cultures affected by industrialization and overexploitation, as well as urban wastelands full of crime and violence, graffiti, and disorder within high technological societies, which very much evokes our world, our late modern capitalist society. Its many amenities and entertainments, but also its many inequalities and deprivations and damaged and destroyed infrastructure, as well as entire planets that are mercantile, industrial, about exploitation on a large scale, where if there were indigenous populations, they are now operating within this, galaxy-wide systems of hypercapitalism. And in the Outer Rim, we particularly find colonial frontiers, settlers in alien lands, very much like Western desert frontiers, lawless, where farmers interact with indigenous people, conflicting with each other, and sometimes having to collaborate, as with Mos Pelgo in season 2 on Tatooine. and their architecture is very much inspired by a range of different Middle Eastern styles that evoke this idea of desert trade routes, of um, settlements, mining, and farming on the very edges in cruel and unforgiving environments. And that very much evokes the story of medieval and post-medieval trade routes through Central Asia, across the Sahara, and of course the colonial experience in the Americas. And we have within these worlds various non-human artisans who are outside of that industrial system, but they are perhaps exploiting and adapting to those local environments, making do with and making things work for others, utilizing old tech. And the Ugnaughts on Avala 7 and Plaisir 15 perhaps fit into that model. And we find outside of that colonial and industrial and mercantile world, we find more simple environments, as well as ice worlds and desert worlds where there's very few people. We encounter the pleasant, almost idyllic pan-indigenous utopia of Sorgan, which is the focus for a kind of Magnificent Seven episode, where krill farmers are utilize some high-tech droids, but are largely living in a peaceful riverine and forest environment, using labor, emphasis on irrigation and protection, but they're attacked by a redeployed Imperial AT-AT and a band of marauders, and that's the context in which Grogu and the Mandalorian have to help save them from the bandits. So we do get this sort of architectures here inspired by Southeast Asian, African, and American indigenous people to create this sort of ideal of a untouched world, but under threat from the chaos of the post-imperial era. Um, and within these worlds, across these sparsely inhabited planets, Navarro, Tatooine, Avala 7, we have the Jawas, who are a very interesting species that we learn more about through The Mandalorian. And their material culture is very interesting because at one level, their material culture is everyone else's. But also they have their own distinctive vehicles for navigating complex terrain in deserts and semi-deserts. They have their own cowls, their distinctive brown robes and hoods, their almost semi-monastic appearance, which sort of it sits in tension with the fact that they are egalitarian, they are defensive, loyal, brave, but they also have a dark sense of humor, and they are utter thieves. So they have that idea of they live off stolen weapons and devices. They're droid slavers. They will rip apart and steal anything, recycling itinerant, marginalized communities who very much mirror derogatory perceptions of itinerant and nomadic peoples in our world. And so this is actually a very interesting sort of tension here of communities that are industrious and resourceful within these complex material landscapes. And they speak of the many different ways we find recycling as integral to the human story, past and present. But they also show the tensions in our world and the perceptions of marginalization of people that have to, through poverty and through cultural inheritance, operate on the edges of industrialized societies and settled communities, and exploit and adapt and trade and utilize the things that are left behind. And so through the Jawas, we get access to and engagement with a significant part of our human story, in a more meaningful way than actually in many other fictions, that most human societies have been nomadic to some degree and exploiting and recycling materials over the long term. But the indigenous representation of Tatooine is particularly focused on the Tusken Raiders, who we encounter in A New Hope for the first time as bad guys living the Jundland wastes, and who are violent and territorial. They ride their banthas, and in subsequent films and backstories, we see them as equivalent to derogatory representations in westerns of Native Americans, the Plains Indians, who are stereotyped as sort of raiders and marauders. But we get a much more respectful interrogation of their culture in the Mandalorian, in the book of Boba Fett, where the Tuscans are revealed as the original indigenous people of Tatooine, whose landscape has been increasingly harsh as climate change has dried up the landscape. Now, we don't get a sense of whether that was anthropogenic or any other factors, but certainly they're living increasingly arid and difficult environments. They exploit the natural resources as best as possible, plants and fungi. They ride their banthas that they've domesticated, and they live in temporary settlements of makeshift tents. And we encounter that not only are they um, riding their banthas and caring for them? They have an intimate relationship with these non-human persons. They brush their teeth, they name them. Their banthas are more than simply transportation, we learn, but also with the massifs, they have hounds of guard, beasts that are sort of reptilian hounds. And also the Krayt dragon, they have a symbiotic relationship with the Krayt dragon and seemingly other monsters that live in these wastelands. The Krayt dragon, they feed banthas to regulate its sleep, to live in some kind of not necessarily harmony, but with intention with the Krayt dragon. They will hunt them if they can. They will fight them, but they also try to manage them, and that I think shows this more integrated, sustainable relationship to landscape. And we learn about how most of human history, humans have done this through this science fiction world. And through the book of Boba Fett, we also learn, no matter how incongruous and irrational it is, that cremation is a further part of this Tuscan world. So the Tuscans cremate the dead with bits of wood. It doesn't quite make sense, even if you imagine the Tuscans are particularly flammable. These pyres just simply wouldn't be effective. But it is an insight, a window onto how these science fiction worlds give us insight into traditional customs, their dances, their rites of initiation, their hunting practices, their scavenging practices, their interactions with each other, their combat with the Pike Syndicate, but also how they honor the dead. And Boba Fett honors that and participates in their funerary rituals of cremation. So it's a rare and important example of science fiction cremation practices which draw off the distant past and contemporary or recent non-Western traditional non-industrial modes of burning the dead as a way of honoring those that have passed on. Now, there are two further case studies that I think are particularly interesting that have archaeological themes and connections in the Mandalorian in this post-imperial world of the Star Wars universe. The first of these two is the planet of Navarro, where the city is very much modeled on a direct inspiration from the ancient Mediterranean past, because Navarro is a volcanic planet, and the city on Navarro is very much inspired by ancient Roman, Greek and Roman cities of the Mediterranean world, and it's almost like a Pompeii that didn't die, a Pompeii that lives with a volcano, with volcanic activity, but is not completely destroyed by it, because the whole city is part covered by the act of volcanic activity. There are lava flows that are somehow controlled and contained by architecture through drainage and sewers, as well as evidence that many of the houses are covered by basalt. Now, no matter how, in other words, old lava flows. Now, how much this actually makes any volcanological or geological sense is not really the point. You have, though, a city that's beset by but survives within this harsh and uh, dominated by a landscape dominated by volcanoes. And many of the elements of the city, its markets, its public spaces, and its triumphal arch or monument, very much speak to Pompeii and Herculaneum. This is very much inspired by an ancient Roman city, and particularly the two cities destroyed by in the first century CE by Vesuvius erupting. So you have that early Roman classical world evoked, but very much this is a city in beyond its prime. We get the sense of a deep time landscape, a city and a planet that's been occupied by imperial forces, invaded, destroyed, retaken by the rebels. We get a sense that Grief Karga, about the head of the Bounty Hunters Guild, but then he becomes a governor, is a kind of protector of a kind of late antique city. He's very much autonomous, um, lip service to the New Republic, but is very much his own person and negotiating, as we see in season 3, with pirates who want to take over Navarro. And they sit between. They're not in formal alliance or integrate into the protection of the New Republic, and therefore they are open to attack and 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 controlled by pirates and others. And so here you can see in the first season an aerial view of the central sort of market square and this ruined monumental arch. It's shown as a ruin, an ancient monument that sort of marks the entrance into the city from the volcanic flats. So you get the sense of a threshold, a symbolic threshold of an ancient city. And an important point is that when Grief Karga becomes protector, he replaces it, he renews it, he regenerates this bit of monumental architecture, but nothing else. And eventually, obviously, trade and commerce, this laissez-faire capitalist nature of the Star Wars universe, just by happenstance makes it a cleaner, more prosperous place. But it's very much the only feature that we see of monumental rebuilding is, well, his own palace in season 3, his own sort of central um, courts, but particularly this monumental threshold to give this sort of uh, articulation of power, of order, sort of trying to claw back from a deep time city that has seen better days. And other parts in season 3 of his clawing back is he repurposes IG-11, who helped save Grief Karga and the Mandalorian from the Imperial remnant forces of Moff Gideon in season 1, has been erected as a statue made from the droid. So the droid is the statue. I think it's a really interesting use of droids as material culture. And once the attempt to bring back IG-11 fails, and IG-12, but before IG-12 is created as a new sort of suit for Grogu, we see another aspect of his attempts at kind of imperial magistrate or protectorate role. Grief Karga creates his own bust, which a droid uses to crush IG-11 in a humorous but rather tense fight scene. But it's another example of how Grief Karga is acting like with the vainglories of power and the trappings of authority in a very fragile outer rim frontier zone. Now, the other main historical and archaeological theme to talk about are the Mandalorians themselves, a people that have been decimated by a genocide by the Imperial forces, and Mandalore is turned to glass, as it's described, but who are the survivors, and particularly the Children of the Watch, an extremist sect who follow a code of the warrior, are amongst those that survive and are part of a diaspora of Mandalorians out in the galaxy, hunted for their shiny shells, but also trying to operate in hiding. So we find them in the coverts, as they call them, in the sewers of Navarro, where Din Djarin is funding their presence, as well as we see Din Djarin and other Mandalorians out in hiding in other worlds within the Outer Rim once their planet has been destroyed. And the Mandalorian and Bo-Katan Kryze form an alliance with other Mandalorians to retake Mandalore. And the very storyline is very much like archaeological detection, that the Mandalorian encounters an artifact that's supposed to be brought back from Mandalore, and it proves that the air is breathable, and this cursed planet, this dead planet, is then revisited, and to test its air quality. It's found to be encountered by dangerous scavengers and a kind of troglodyte type species that's indigenous to Mandalore. but has re-inhabited the spaces the Mandalorians had left. And the Mandalorians throughout this storyline operate very much like a early medieval, a stereotype, not an actual historical reality, a modern stereotype of the early medieval barbarian warrior cultures like the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, and Vikings in our popular culture. They have weapons and armor that are heirlooms, have magical qualities. They follow the armorer, who is like a magical smith, like Wayland the Smith Volander of Norse tradition. Their armor and weapons attract have a prestige and power and value. They attract war fights. They attract violence, but it also asserts their special warrior status. The armor explains that their philosophy as Mandalorians is tied to their armor and their initiation and their journey into being Mandalorians, which is not ethnically defined but is culturally ascribed through rites of passage and a philosophy, almost a religion, as Din Djarin says, weapons are our religion. So they're an extension of the personhood of the Mandalorian, which very much reflects archaeological discussions of masculine warrior dominated societies from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age into the Middle Ages of Eurasia. And we see that, as the armourer says, the Mandalorians shape steel, but are themselves shaped by it. And Grogu's journey to becoming a Mandalorian is very much by acquiring bits of armor. It's a composite process of as you repair and augment your armor, your status as a Mandalorian enhances your identity, interacts with the different scales and designs of the armor. So each Mandalorian has a different armor in the Children of the Watch, but they in and more formalized with Bo-Katan Kryze's followers, but they all are, their armor and their weapons make the Mandalorians, and so we see that material culture is integral to the Mandalorians, reflecting off many past and recent warrior societies, martial societies. And this idea is taken further when we go to Kalevala, the moon, where Bo-Katan Kryze is in her castle, a castle that's on a isthmus, very much like the Cornish castle of Tintagel. It very much evokes this chivalric ideal past, and she is found in this lavish, so obviously science fiction architecture, but called a castle with a one droid as her servant. She's sitting there like a sulky teenager with great murals of the great deeds of her ancestors behind her, but with no followers. She's a king without a court, a queen without a court. And so Din Djarin goes to her, she dismisses him, but then she comes to his aid when he tries on his own to investigate Mandalore. And the exploration of Mandalore is very much like an archaeological adventure into a dark and haunted, dangerous, complex, decimated space. We encounter the creatures that are harvesting Mandalorians that survive and other tech and mech, and we encounter in the deep mines of Mandalore, in the waters where Din Djarin hopes to be redeemed. Bo-Katan mocks it as something that has no spiritual significance. She even points out the Heritage Interpretation Board, so it's a bit of archaeology of Mandalore. As interpreted by Mandalorians for visiting Mandalorians and others, so it's almost like a heritage site that then she's mocking the aesthetic and the antiquity of this supposedly sacred place to the Children of the Watch. She just treats it as a princess who inherited this glory, and also they reflect on the deep time antiquity that within living memory this had been a vibrant city, and yet its utter destruction renders it completely empty and bereft and haunted. Now, there was one final theme to address in the archaeology of the Mandalorian. Now, we talked about cremations amongst the Tuscans, but there's only one lead character who dies and is given a funeral in the Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, and that is Quill, the Ugnaught. And this is really interesting because, as an archaeologist who specializes in funerary archaeology, this is perhaps the most interesting element. This this death of a character and how he's treated, and you get a kind of isolated funeral that fits many of our tropes of westerns and other science fiction where funerals happen for individuals in isolation. It's the only funeral in The Mandalorian. As I said, there are Tuscan funerals, mass cremations in 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 2 points in the book of Boba Fett, but but not by main characters. And the Mandalorian goes back alone and builds a little cairn in the desert, having buried Quill in a makeshift grave. Quill had been killed by stormtroopers, having trying to defend Grogu, and it's almost like a heartless solo mission. There's nobody attending. Quill is forgotten by everyone else, but he's honoured by the Mandalorian. There's limited engagement with mortuary material culture, but the grave is an important example of how, in post-apocalyptic dramas and in westerns, the grave is an isolated grave in the wastelands, in the wilderness, symbolises the adventurous landscape and the disconnect and the lonely existence of the travellers in these frontier zones. But another theme that I want to point out, though, is the widespread Hollywood trope, which comes from the Western world, the Western frontiers of America, of objects placed on graves that are anthropomorphize the grave and connect the grave to an individual. So here we have the hat and goggles of the Ugnaught Quill are anthropomorphize the grave by giving the grave make it a site of memory through not grave offerings, not grave goods, because they're not buried in the ground, but placed on the ground. And therefore, I think this is another good example in our popular fiction about how material cultures, integral to the identity of a person in life, sort of are used to fix that identity onto a grave, even if it's isolated and mourned by only Dinjarin, without any religious ceremony or any epitaph, simply a pile of rocks, but made special, made personal through the association with the helmet and goggles. So that's my little review as I see it. And I'm sure there are other themes that we could address of the archaeology of the Mandalorian in the book of Boba Fett. There's more that could be said about Mos Espa. There's more that could be said about Navarro and about many other aspects of the world of the Mandalorian in this post after Empire aesthetic, and this a world that's running down and broken up and full of it's a space western, but a space barbarian world of the early Middle Ages after Empire. That's my thesis, and that's the way I look at it as an archaeologist. Of course, there are questions. What further archaeology would you conduct as part of the Outer Rim Archaeological Survey? Where would you go, and what themes would you explore in the material world of the Star Wars galaxy?
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.